Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to let folks trickle in and get started with the webinar in about 1 minute. So grab your water, use the bathroom, whatever you need to do, and we'll get started here in just a minute. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started so we can give Kristen and Shelby plenty of time to talk about this very important topic. Before we get started, I'm Katie Mascalunas. I'm the Director of Special Projects and Events at the National Center for Victims of Crime, and we're so excited that you're joining us for the first installment in our Countdown to Portland, an NTI webinar series. Today's webinar is going to be on developing long-term storage system for sexual assault kits. Next slide, please. So a couple housekeeping things before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll have access to it afterwards. You can share it with anyone on your team that you think would be interested. If you're having technical issues, please send a private chat message to Dashel Coleman. He should be on your presenter tab in the chat function. We are not doing attendance certificates or CE credits for this session. Live captioning is also available if you need that. If you click on show captions at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to enable that. And then if you have questions for Kristen and Shelby, please put those in the Q&A box, not the chat function. It's really hard to keep up with because we know everyone likes to chat in that section. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we should have a few minutes for those at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. And we would love for you to join us at the National Training Institute. I know many of you registered have already come to our NTIs in the past, but we want to have you again this year. So we are in Portland, September 18th through 20th. We have a tremendous agenda that has just been posted online, so you can go to our website to check that out. Over 60 workshop sessions over 3 days. We have 5 incredible plenaries that we'll be announcing in the coming weeks and months. We do CE credits for this event. And we are in early bird registration right now. So you have a couple more days to save $50. We would love to have you. If you have any questions about NTI or NCVC generally, you can contact us at National Training Institute at victimsofcrime.org. Next slide, please. And our next webinar, we're going to be doing these once per month leading up to NTI. Our next webinar is going to be Wednesday, May 22nd at the same time. It's on internet safety and warning signs of online grooming. And the registration will be coming out for that within the next week or so. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful presenters, Kristen and Shelby from the New York State Office of Victim Services. And I will be back to take some questions and give them to our presenters later on. Thanks so much.
Okay, always have to find the mute button for myself. So thank you very much for that introduction. This presentation will be discussing the development of a long-term storage system for unreported sexual offense evidence kits, the related items of those kits, and how it can positively impact victims. Little introductions. My name is Kristen Connor. I'm the Administrative Services Unit Chief here in the New York State Office of Victim Services. I have been in this position for the past 2 years. I joined OVS a year before being promoted to this position. My unit handles all of the purchasing, finance, and budget aspects for our agency, as well as overseeing the team that maintains and operates the storage facility. And joining me is Shelby.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I would like to thank the folks for inviting us to be part of this webinar series. So thank you for that. And I really want to thank my co-presenter here, Kristen. I have 3 different screens going right now. So if I'm looking in different areas, it's because I'm trying to look at Kristen while also looking at the slides. So pardon my eyes. I am the associate attorney here for the Office of Victim Services. I primarily focus on sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking matters for the agency. I also sit on our appeal panel and hear and render appeal decisions. I provide work-related legal advice and information to agency staff. I also perform legal and regulatory research, analysis, and drafting. I also oversee our forensic rape exam direct reimbursement program, which we'll talk a little bit about later on a legal policy level. We have someone else that handles the day-to-day processing piece of that program. And the reason that I'm here today, Kristen will do most of the talking, but the reason that I'm here today is because I did lead the OVS efforts in the development of this long-term storage facility before the handoff to Kristen when it became operational. So thank you.
Yep, Shelby got us started and I'm carrying it through. So the objective of this presentation is to provide an overview of the changes to New York State's retention period for unreported sexual offense evidence kits, which we'll also refer to as SOECKs. The development of that long-term storage facility to retain these, and also share the impact that this can have on victims and survivors of sexual assault. Some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today is why storing unreported evidence matters just as much as storing and testing reported evidence. Shelby will go over the New York State public health law with her attorney hat on. And then we'll go through what OVS did, where we are today, where we're going, and then some lessons learned for you to bring back to your states and your organizations for similar projects. Before we get started, just some terms to remember. As I mentioned, SOECK stands for Sexual Offense Evidence Collection Kit. This is the box itself that the forensic nurses use to collect the swabs and the DNA from the victim who presents at the hospital. We also will be using the term item. This relates to any associated evidence item and or a complete SOECK itself. So this could be anything from bedding, jewelry, or clothing that the victim turns over to the forensic nurse during the exam. And then there's 2 differentiations between the types of items. These are terms that we used ourselves, mostly for data and analysis. We're referring to anything that was collected at the hospital prior to our facility opening in 2023 as a legacy item. And then anything that's been collected since then, we're referring to as a new item. I also just want to make a comment that we here at the Office of Victim Services typically use the term victim, but we acknowledge that other individuals might use the term survivor or other terms that they prefer to identify by. So we just want to acknowledge and respect that everyone has an individual choice in how they would like to be identified. But we use the term victim in our office. Okay. So why does storing evidence matter? And I'm going to turn it over to Shelby to kind of start it up.
Thank you, Kristen. So the purpose of a forensic rape examination, or FRE, is to be victim-centered medical care. But it also can be an attempt to collect DNA that may be used in prosecution. And this brings us to how we arrived at our internal, working title for this presentation. We've been referring to it as "Don't wait until it's too late." But then there became too many words for the title, so we had to cut. And the title we have now is more specific to our subject matter. It is clear about what to expect about the presentation. But what we want to do is we want to encourage victims to access medical care immediately after or shortly after their assault, not only for their own personal health and safety, but also to, have the best chance of collecting usable evidence should they decide to move forward with reporting their assaults to law enforcement. And as I'm sure that you're all aware, there are time limits to when, you have the best chance of collecting usable evidence. And those time limits can range from, I think the most common are 72 to 96 to 120 hours after an assault. New York is actually a 120-hour state, but I have heard anecdotally from the same nurses that I work with through the course of the various items that I work on here, that they do really treat it as a case-by-case situation, and they have collected evidence even after that 120-hour mark. But understanding that there may be concerns for payment, you have someone that is still on their parents' insurance and they don't want their parents to know, or they don't want their partner to know. There may be some concerns over payment. So I do just want to take a moment to highlight our forensic rape exam direct reimbursement program, which I mentioned earlier. And that is governed by New York State executive law. And essentially what it does is it provides victims the option to use their own insurance if they would like to pay for their exam. But they can also say, I don't want to use my insurance, or I don't have insurance, so I want you to bill the Office of Victim Services for my sexual assault examination. So this program ensures that a sexual assault survivor will not have to pay for their own forensic exam if they don't want to or can't, while also avoiding another added stressor to an already very traumatic event. And we just have a note here about DNA. It's very interesting to me. DNA profiling started in 1984. But in reality, that was only 40 years ago. So that's a short time frame, relatively in the science field. So I feel like there's a lot that we don't know yet about DNA, and we have yet to discover and learn. In fact, my daughter is going to college right now to be a forensic scientist specializing in DNA. So hopefully she happens to be one of those folks on the edge of new innovation and technology.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen now.
Yeah, I thought that was a fun tidbit too. I'm 1 year older than DNA profiling, so it really puts it into perspective for me. Okay. So FREs, as Shelby mentioned, it's first and foremost about providing that medical care to the victim. But it also is an opportunity for that individual to begin the potential participation in a criminal justice system. If they're going to go through this experience, something good should be able to come out of it. And that is the collection of the evidence that could be used. What the FRE is really an opportunity for the victim's voice to be heard. It's a documentation and collecting of the evidence. So in a legal sense, it's the evidence in the criminal justice process that could prove that that offender is guilty. So we know why it matters from a legal perspective and the criminal justice perspective as that piece of evidence, but why does it matter for the victim? It matters because, as we know, all too often people are not believed. The evidence adds weights to their words. There's also factors like not feeling that they can identify the perpetrator. It might be someone that they don't know or whose face they can't see. Personally, I can't remember describing a person's face enough to be able to allow a sketch artist. That's just who I am. I cannot look at Shelby and really describe her other than, a Caucasian woman with blonde hair. The details of her face is not something I personally am able to describe with the way that my brain and my words work. And victims are often put into a position where they have to prove that they're not lying, and that's a terrible place to be. Drugs or alcohol consumption, whether by force or choice, can impair memory. And of course, the neurobiological responses to trauma have a huge impact on memory and cognitive processes that, similar to DNA profiling, we're still learning so much about, and there needs to be a lot more education about that. And thankfully, there's movements towards that. And another reason is if a perpetrator is in a position of power, the evidence in all of these cases can support and back up what the victim is saying. But why unreported kits? Why does it matter for those victims? And this is just a very short list of some of the reasons why individuals do not report the assault. As we mentioned, trauma responses, position of power, but there's also a fear of hostility, retribution, retaliation, threats of violence, especially if it's a domestic partner or intimate partner violence situation. And then there's victim blaming, lying, fear, shame, shock, all of these feelings that an individual could be going through. I don't know the specific statistics, and a lot of that has to do with the unknowns of those that don't present to a hospital, as well as those that don't immediately report the assault. But a common statistic that you hear is that only 1 in 5 victims may report a sexual assault. So what is the point in getting the FRE, the forensic rape exam, if you're not reporting it? Well, the number one reason could be the victim decides later on that they want to report it. Memories could resurface. They could be going through therapeutic treatments, and finally comfortable enough to be able to report the assault to law enforcement. There's sometimes strengths in numbers, the Me Too movements. In New York State, we just recently had and Shelby can jump in on here, the Child Victims Act. So child sexual assault victims were finally given some voices and able to speak up. Child victims who are older, relationships end. So if a domestic partnership involves sexual assault and that relationship ends, that victim might then feel comfortable to say, this is what happened to me. I had a kit collected and now I'm ready to report the assault and hold that individual accountable for their actions. And it could just simply be they confide in someone and that person believes them and gives them the support that they hadn't had at the time of the initial exam. And then kind of making this full circle, we're learning that the DNA can still be tested beyond what used to be, in New York State at least, just a 30-day retention period. So I'm going to toss it back to Shelby to talk about the New York State public health law and the changes that happened.
Thank you. Kristen did just kind of spoil it a little bit, but we'll get into that. I did want to give everyone an overview of the New York State public health law, at least as it relates to the treatment of sexual offense victims and the maintenance of evidence. So prior to 2018, hospitals were only required to store sex offense evidence collection kits and related materials for a minimum of 30 days. What was happening across our state was not every hospital had capacity. So at the 30-day mark, some hospitals had to purge that evidence. I mean, day 31, it had to go. Other hospitals didn't have capacity issues, so they were actually maintaining their storage for much longer, if not indefinitely. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the kits that we received when the facility opened up. In April of 2018, the law changed and increased the storage time frame from a minimum of 30 days to 20 years. A significant jump. What the law did was it also established a work group of state partners to study, evaluate, and make recommendations concerning the storage and monitoring of this type of evidence. That work group included the New York State Department of Health, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, state police, and our office. Next slide. In April of 2021, OVS was officially named the responsible agency for the 20-year storage of the sexual offense evidence. Some highlights include the 20-year storage from date of collection, transfer of that storage to the OVS facility within 10 days of collection. And then also notification to the victim at least 90 days prior to the expiration of that storage period, provided that they opted for such notifications. Some folks may not want to be notified or reminded of this 19 years and 9 months after the fact. So they can certainly opt out of future notifications. And Kristen will talk a little bit about our tracking system later on, but our tracking system does allow a victim to change their mind if they want. If they have opted in for notifications, they can change it later, or if they've opted out, they can go back and change it to allow notifications in the future. Another note I just wanted to point out is that we cannot continue to store these items if the victim has requested that they be released to law enforcement or that we dispose of the evidence. The legislation, however, did not include any language requiring a tracking system for long-term storage. So in March of 2023, DCJS was charged with establishing a statewide electronic tracking system for evidence kits that are being released to law enforcement, and that is expected to be operational by 2025. There tends to be some confusion about tracking systems. They are not one and the same. The tracking system that we developed needed to be developed for purposes of tracking, storing, and maintaining the evidence that was coming to our long-term storage facility. So that is specific to the unreported kits. If a victim, however, chooses to report, then that kit will eventually, once operational, be tracked by this separate tracking system that only involves those kits that are being reported and released to law enforcement.
Yeah, we've had to answer lots of questions about tracking systems.
Yeah.
All right, so Shelby kind of covered some of it as far as the timeline is concerned, but now we'll get into some of the more detailed things about what OVS did once we became the responsible party. And this is where Shelby kind of started us off. I was hired into my current position and then have been kind of taking it from there.
Yes.
So here's a high level overview. So I'll have Shelby get us started and then I'll finish this one off.
So I want to say, I made some notes on this slide here about things that I wanted to say, but then I noticed that Kristen actually created individual slides that are probably going to repeat the things that I'm saying now. So apologies for that, but we're really getting the information across. So again, as I mentioned, in April of 2021, it was determined that OVS was the agency that was going to be responsible for this. A single centralized location was selected by the prior administration. Now, the facility itself is very secure. It is a state-owned building, but it did require construction modifications to the property to ensure that it's meeting the needs of its new purpose. We did work to identify essential requirements for tracking the items that are being transferred to and stored at the facility. We worked with in-state and out-of-state partners that had similar operations. We also worked with other state partners to establish proper handling, storage, and tracking protocols. And I really do want to give a huge shout out to our colleagues at the New York State Police. They were incredibly helpful and instrumental throughout the initial planning phase. They allowed us to tour their forensic lab so we could see how the evidence is being stored when it's in their custody. And that really helped guide how we knew that it needed to be stored before it potentially got to them. We had our colleagues at the New York State Department of Health conducted a survey of all hospitals in our state to determine the number of items being held at the time of the survey. So we could then establish necessary estimates for our planning. We actively engaged outside stakeholders, namely our coalitions, so the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We also we engaged with SANE nurses through the New York State chapter of the International Association for Forensic Nurses. We then expanded that stakeholder outreach and we held 3 town hall sessions to solicit feedback on victim notification, transfer and receipt of new and existing kits, as well as disposal and return. In 2022, the operational planning began and Kristen joined our group. And it's been amazing to work with her since, but that's pretty much all you're going to hear from me now. Now this is Kristen's show.
Yeah, Shelby can definitely jump in where needed though. And I definitely second what Shelby said about the assistance that the State Police Forensic Lab gave to us. not only for the storage of the items and the physical conditions that we needed in the building, environmental conditions, et cetera, but we also talked with them about the nuances of tracking items throughout their entire processes, which really helped with the procurement of our tracking system. So that was the number one thing that I started working on when I entered this role, was trying to find a vendor to build us a system. We knew what we wanted it to do and what we didn't want it to do. And unfortunately, we had a very, very tight timeline to get it done. I definitely don't recommend it, but we were able to do software development in 2 months. And the only reason we were able to do that was because there was an existing system that they were able to specifically customize for what we needed. And we made some choices about what we needed right away and what we needed later. We also started working on the administrative planning. So not only hiring me into this position, but we needed an additional staff person in my office, as well as the staff that would be at the facility. We needed to develop policies and procedures, office supply, ordering equipment, furniture, all of those things. It was a purchasing machine going on in my office for that. And then we continued doing additional planning. We reached out to the hospitals that were on the survey that Shelby mentioned. We used that survey to come up with estimates of how many items could have been collected between the date of that survey and when we expected to open. There were 200 plus hospitals. We needed to do planning on how to onboard those hospitals into this new system, give them the training for our tracking system, and figure out the logistics of getting the items from the hospitals to our facility. So accepting that, we did a phase-in plan. We were able to divide up the areas of New York State into various regions. And that really helped us test out and essentially kind of do like a little bit of a pilot for those first couple of hospitals. They were closer to where the central storage facility is, so we were able to make sure that there weren't going to be significant logistic issues. And then where we are today, and we'll get into more details of that shortly, is just looking towards the future and this 20-year period that we have to retain these. So kind of going back to what Shelby worked on, she worked on the work groups, participated in a lot of those. It was definitely a team effort in gathering the information and doing that initial planning for what we needed to do. It included the data collection of items. DOH was very helpful in this capacity. But then internally, we needed to analyze the staffing needs and our organizational changes. Where was this project going to fit within our agency? Who was going to be responsible? We have a grants team, we have our victim compensation program, my office, the Office of Administrative Services, who was best suited for this. So those decisions needed to be made. For the construction, Shelby definitely led the charge on this one for the initial construction, of which I'm thankful for. As she mentioned, we had an existing state-owned building that was selected, but needed significant renovations. The design of that building, we received the input from the forensic labs for the environmental conditions, how much space we would need, the type of shelving that we would need to store the items. And then the physical construction of the renovation included building an office area for our staff, a receiving area for the items to come into the facility, where we can do a triage, document everything, record it in our tracking system before we put it in the storage room. It includes a primary storage room. And we also have cold storage for the drug facilitated sexual assault kits that contain blood and urine samples if those are collected. We have HVAC environmental controls. And we also have it's pretty cool how it works. I kind of geeked out a little bit on the fire suppression system. But it's a non-water-based fire suppression system. It's a standard that's used in record centers. If there is a fire and sprinklers turn on, obviously those records are going to be damaged. But this particular type of system releases a gas which helps extinguish a fire if it occurs, and does not cause damage to the materials that are stored in the room where the suppression system is put in place. For operational planning, we did stakeholder engagement, again, with coalitions, victim assistance providers, medical facilities, and a special shout out to our community engagement liaison, Lauren, for assisting in coordinating those. It was a big lift and not her job, and she did a fantastic effort on that. The stakeholder engagement and those town hall sessions that we held were very, very valuable for the feedback because it helped us inform the policies and procedures, but also a consent form. As Shelby mentioned, we are not allowed to store the items if a victim chooses to release it to law enforcement, requests it be disposed of prior to that 20-year period, or they request the return of their personal items. So if they provided a necklace to the forensic nurse and they want that back, we will send that back to them, but we need their consent in order to do so. And then the tracking system procurement. It was certainly a challenge, but ended up being really, really useful. The public health law didn't require it, but we knew we needed something in place, especially in trying to coordinate the collection of 10,000 plus items across 200 plus hospitals. And New York State is not a small state geographically. Not everything is within 30 minutes of New York City or Albany. Some of our furthest cities from Albany, where our main office is located, is 5 hours, a little bit longer to where the storage facility is for some places. So we needed to track the items from that point of collection through the transportation to the long-term storage facility. And then also within the storage facility, if we needed to move things from one shelf to another, we needed to be able to know where it was and where any other items associated with that SOECK are stored, because they might not be in the same box or the same location as the SOECK. We also have a separate room for the DFSAs. Needing to track where those are was important. We have 3 portals for this tracking system. We have a portal specifically for the victims. This does not require them to have an email address or a password to log in. There are safety protocols, so only they should be able to access it because they would have the specific information they need to enter. It gives them a high-level overview of where their kit is. So whether it's in hospital, being transported to OVS, or it's with OVS. If they choose to report it to law enforcement, the status will be updated to reflect that request as well. And they can also update their contact information. So as Shelby discussed, they can opt in and out of any notifications. They can update their cell phone number, their email address, and we also added in features for them to be able to change their personal pronouns and gender identity to align with New York State priorities and policies. And the hospital portal is access for the hospital staff themselves. This is limited for them to view only the information related to their hospital. So Albany Medical Center can only view information for the information. They can only view information for the cases that they entered. They won't be able to see the information that Saratoga Hospital or New York Presbyterian enters. And then of course the OVS portal, we can see everything and manage and coordinate all of the functionality of the system. The second purpose for the tracking system was also to make sure that we have full chain of custody information. We treat these items as potential evidence. At any point, a victim may choose to report to law enforcement. We turn it over and we want to make sure that we're giving that law enforcement agency as much information as possible so that throughout the criminal justice process, the weight of the evidence is not questioned when it comes to where it was, who obtained it, who touched it, where it was stored. And then last but not least, the notification feature, which was a requirement of the public health law. It's the only notification we currently have. It is 90 days prior to the expiration of the 20-year period, and the victim can choose either text, email, or a physical letter. It is up to them which option they prefer. But the system will automatically trigger this and send it out. For the administrative planning, I touched on some of these: developing policies and procedures, hiring staff, purchasing equipment, procuring services, things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. It reminded me of like moving into a new house when you forget that you need a garbage can for your extra bathroom that you now have, or paper towels and these types of things. You know, we'd sit down and come up with a list, next time we sat down, we would come up with another list of services. Janitorial services, making sure that we're maintaining the security of the facility while we're procuring all of these services was a factor of utmost importance to us. And then one of the other challenges, and we can get into this a little bit more with the lessons learned, was communication to the hospitals. The survey that was sent out was 2021. COVID was at its peak. 200 plus hospitals across New York State, vast staffing changes and challenges. Just having the right email address sometimes was difficult, but that was a very heavy lift in trying to communicate to all of these hospitals across the state with various partners and individuals within them. But we were successful. We were finally able to open the storage facility in January 2023 and accept the first items in that month. We continued to do outreach to the medical facility and proceed with the phase-in plan. We identified a couple of changes that we needed to our tracking system, which was not unexpected with the short timeline that we had. We were able to implement the most important ones first, following our phase-in plan so that it didn't cause major disruptions to those hospitals that were in the thick of entering the information and sending us items. And then we started thinking about the future, kind of always forward thinking.
Kristen, I just want to take a moment, like operational January 2023, like for those of us that might not be quick at doing math, that's 18 months.
Yeah.
Right. So like that's impressive for everything that we had to do right from start to finish. Maybe I did that math wrong. 20 months, 18 to 20 months. See, I said, for those of us that are not quick at math, for everything from finding our location, construction, to everything that comes along with it, with us being able to start accepting those kits. To have that happen that quickly was just remarkable. And we're thankful to all of our partners, but also, you know, I know that we do have some of our colleagues on this webinar today too. And I just want everyone to know how appreciative we are of all of the work that was put in from every level of our staff and our agency to really try to get this to where it needed to be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, right now, Shelby and I are literally the faces of this presentation. But this presentation itself was originally planned and proposed by our former director, Elizabeth Cronin. So shout out to Elizabeth for this. But none of it would have been able to accomplish because while Shelby and I were focusing on this project and our various aspects of it, the other tasks that we needed to do occasionally fell on other people's shoulders. So thank you very much to all of those who helped out when we were extremely busy writing procurements and attending construction meetings. So where we're at today, I just wanted to kind of give like a visual and an overview of what the intake process is from getting the items from the hospital to our storage facility. So again, these are for unreported kits. The hospital, once they determine that the victim has chosen not to report it to law enforcement, according to the public health law, they need to send it to our storage facility within 10 days. So to do that, they have to enter the information into kits. They need to inform the victim of the long-term storage so that they can know later on, if they choose to, that it can be reported, released to law enforcement, or disposed of, whatever their choice is. And then they need to prepare the items for delivery. And we, under the consultation of the forensic lab, have two options for hospitals to send these to us. As I mentioned, some of the locations in New York State are 5+ hours away from where the storage location is. So we give the hospitals the option of doing either a direct delivery, literally a hospital staff person or a courier loading these items into a car or a van and sending them to us and driving to the facility. They can also ship them via common courier. So this is standard UPS, FedEx. The only caveat is they need to have the items delivered and shipped to us within a 24-hour window. And that helps us maintain the proper environmental conditions for the items. And it also makes sure that we get the items as quickly as possible to minimize any issues with the chain of custody. Once they arrive at our storage facility, the wonderful team up there receive the items, bring them into the building, check them for damage, make sure that all of the information on the items is correct, that if we receive items associated with an SOECK, those non-kit items that we're referring to, or DFSA, we make sure that we have all of those. Our tracking system kits is updated to reflect that we received them. And then the items are placed into our long-term storage location, whether that's the cooler for the DFSA or the shelving units that we have for the SOECK and other items. Our current operations and our current projects, we're continuing to do outreach to medical facilities, getting additional contact information if they haven't begun the onboarding process and entered information in to our tracking system. If they have entered information but haven't started sending us items, our team is doing that outreach right now. We're also revising our policies and procedures. We're looking back at what we wrote before we were actually doing things and are asking, is this still in line with what we're actually doing? What slight changes and tweaks do we need to make? What are the things that we didn't think of or didn't know before when we were initially drafting these that we now know today? And then we're also looking at the additional improvements that we can make to the tracking system now that we are over a year, 15 months, there's that math. Now that we are 15 months into using the tracking system, we know what works, what doesn't, what workflows we need to change or add, what reports we need. So all of those improvements we're currently working on. And then as far as what we've actually received, our current storage capacity right now is 9,000 items, or up to around 9,000 items. We've received about 4,900 as of this week. I actually just updated these numbers recently. But there's another 4,200 that are entered into the system, but the hospitals have not yet sent it to us. And this is a combination of those legacy items that were collected prior to our facility opening, as well as any items that have been collected since then. And we're also monitoring all of this data to assess the number of new items that could be received annually. And that kind of leads us into where we're going. So the future of the facility is, as I mentioned, continuing to collect and monitor the data to figure out what our intake is going to be and looking at our space and capacity needs. These items need to be stored for 20 years. And the numbers, unfortunately, are not necessarily slowing down. There's always going to be a need to store items every year. What that number is, we don't know yet, but we're collecting the data to determine that. So an example of this is items collected in 2018 when the legislation changed, we need to store until 2038. So in order to do that and to expand our current storage, we are renovating a second wing of the building that we have. This will at minimum double our storage capacity. So we'll go from able to store 9,000 items to around 18,000 or a little bit higher. Some of the factors that are impacting the storage capacity is the estimate of the unreported kits. You know, the survey that DOH provided to us was, Shelby, June 2021, is that correct? That date?
I'm sorry, I just noticed that we started getting a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so I didn't actually hear what you just said. My apologies.
The DOH survey, that was June of 2021?
Yes, June of 2021.
Yeah. So obviously between June of 2021 and January 23, when we opened, kits are being collected at the hospitals. Those numbers were obviously not included in the survey. So we didn't know what those were. We had to make best guess estimates. And some of the data in the survey was unknown or not available. For example, the non-kit items, we didn't know the size of some of them. We didn't know if it was a large comforter that was going to take up one whole space on our shelving, or if it was mostly made up of smaller things where we could fit a lot more. And a lot of that information we don't know until we actually receive the physical item. We're not asking hospitals to get out the rulers and measuring tape and measure those items. So those unknowns are kind of impacting what our capacity currently is. And then the actual count of items. The survey was fantastic, but some of those numbers, you know, might not have been accurate depending on who was filling it out. And again, that information, we don't know whether or not that was accurate, or, you know, they go into another storage area and there's 5 more items. We've also had to quarantine some items. So if an SOECK or non-kit item for some reason has some sort of visible damage on the outside of it, simple example is just a thumb through a paper bag, incidental damage. We're making sure that that item and the integrity of that evidence is protected. So we repackage it, evidence tape, initial, do all of those protocols, but then we're keeping it in a separate location. The number of those items that we need to do that for is not what we expected. And then the fire suppression system, during the construction, the location of where the fire suppression system was going to be ended up changing. And that's taken away just a little bit of space in our storage room. So that has like a slight impact on our initial capacity numbers. And then last but not least, we didn't put a limitation on how old or the initial date of collection of an item. We're allowing hospitals right now to choose whether or not they want to send us items that were collected prior to the legislation change in 2018. We have several of these, the oldest of which was collected in 2010. So because we put the victim's needs first, we will continue to hold on to those items until the retention period ends in 2030. So storing those additional items impacts our capacity as well. Okay. So kind of getting into the lessons learned. Planning, just like real estate, location for projects like this, planning. It is essential. And, you know, as Shelby kind of mentioned, the planning that went into this, we didn't have a whole lot of time for it, but everyone who was involved in the project knew how important this was, and dedicated themselves to doing the planning for it. Prepare for the unexpected. And I can get into some specific examples of this, but it reminds me of the Mike Tyson quote, you know, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So preparing for the unexpected and just knowing how you're going to handle that is a really valuable tool and skill. And then the communication with the hospitals, it's definitely been a challenge. Everybody has a different communication style, but forensic nurses, you know, I can't imagine, you know, what their everyday workload is like. But, you know, being able to answer emails and spend the time entering information into the tracking system and doing a training is an additional strain on those very valuable resources. But even just communicating with the hospitals, what's going on, you know, what the system is, how it should be used, what it should and shouldn't be used for, all of those different types of things. Finding ways to be flexible, and this ties back in with the unexpected. Sometimes things don't go to plan, or you need to adapt and change what you initially designed. The fire suppression system was an example of this, being flexible and saying, okay, well, it can't go here. Let's put it in this location. Finding services to have the operations of the facility go well, being flexible with those types of things. Give yourself time. 18-20 months is not a lot of time to do this, and, you know, make us the exception, not the rule. If you can give yourself more time to do this and planning for it, you know, the better. You're going to have more than 2 months to do software development. So those initial bugs that you have to work out, you wouldn't have if you had a longer time period. If I had a time machine, I'd go back and give us 6 more months of that. And the engagement of the stakeholders. This was probably one of the best decisions that we made on this project, was talking with our staff and our teams here that have relationships with those stakeholders that can coordinate those things. You know, thankfully, we have a wide variety of partners. Shelby has all of the experience in doing you know, this work and collaborating with the coalitions and associations. We also, and I can't remember if Shelby mentioned this, but we leaned into the New York State Hospital Associations as well. So they were really helpful. They hosted webinars for us. So shout out to Greater New York Hospital Association and the Hospital Association of New York State, Haney's. They were fantastic partners. And then revising the procedures and guidance documents, getting the feedback from the hospitals on confusion about what our guidance was. We are currently working on updating the guidance because we don't need to worry about, you know, the onboarding. Now let's focus on moving forward. So revising the procedures kind of ties back in with being flexible. And then again, prepare for the unexpected. Handling information and communication from 200+ hospitals. And not every hospital that was on the survey actually collect sexual offense evidence kits. So being prepared for those changes. New hospitals that didn't get the survey in 2021. There's 800+ hospital users for our tracking system. We kind of expected those numbers, but still it's a bit of a shock to see how many users we actually have in the system. And then the building systems. The existing building that we had was connected to a steam heat system. And winters in New York State are not kind to underground pipes. And we actually had a failure in the steam system. We were able to maintain the heat in the building, but we determined that we needed to separate from that steam system and have our own dedicated heating system. And I'm happy to say that that project has been completed just in time for near summer to happen. And a second winter snowstorm in the middle of March. So, you know, unexpected things like heating going down, redundant HVAC systems, redundant generators, all of which we highly, highly recommend and are having, if we haven't already, we're having those installed in the building. And then, of course, timelines change. You might meet your deadline, you might not meet your deadline, but just being prepared for any of those timeline changes. If you're doing construction on a building, unexpected events like supply chain challenges, you know, that can significantly impact a timeline. So just being flexible with some of those things can be really helpful. All right. So before we jump into the questions, just one final thank you to all of you for attending.
Kristen, I noticed that there are a few questions. Sorry, Katie, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead. Yeah, there are, I think, about 6 questions. So yes. Shelby and Kristen, if there are specific ones that you all saw that you would like to answer, please go ahead. I will let everybody know that Shelby and Kristen are gonna share their contact information with us. So we will pass that along to you all. So if we do not get to your question, you will have a way to reach out to them. Or if it's a more specific question, it might be easier to chat via email there as well. So go ahead, Shelby.
Thank you. No, I actually think that we should be able to get through a bunch of these questions very quickly. So there are 3 questions, I think, about funding, and Kristen, I will let you answer that question. But I'll give you a moment to kind of collect your thoughts since you just did all of that talking. There was a question about, let me see here. If the time is up on a kit and the person is notified of its upcoming destruction, can they ask for an extension? Unfortunately, no, they can't. We cannot store those kits beyond the 20-year time frame. And I think that goes a lot to capacity issues too. You know, if we continue to store all of these kits longer than we are required to by law, that's taking up space for the new kits that need to be coming in for their 20-year storage. So I think it's just a matter of turnaround. There was another question about who retains the reported kits, a lab or police, once they are tested, and how is that paid for? So I do want to be mindful of the limitations that we have. So we're only talking about unreported kits, but it is our understanding that if a victim releases a kit to law enforcement collects that kit. They then determine whether they're going to actually move forward with any testing, and they would be responsible to get that, for getting that to the lab for the actual testing. And then I'm not very familiar with what happens with it after the testing. I don't know if the lab continues to hold on to it or they send it back to law enforcement, but regardless, none of that will come back to us. It's only unreported kits that come to OVS. And there was a question about, does New York allow victims to have kits tested even if they're not reporting to law enforcement? And I think I kind of just answered that too without realizing it. In order for a kit to be tested, it has to be reported to law enforcement, because that is basically, for lack of a better term, the gatekeeper between the victim and the testing is the law enforcement piece of it. So I think I just answered every question that's not money related, which is Kristen's area. So
yeah. I see that there's it looks like a couple questions about the budget and the funding. So just to kind of answer those questions generally, we had about $2.5 million annually for operations and our initial software development. You know, that budget helped purchase all of our initial furniture as well as those initial supplies. Construction, we did have to do in phases. But we received around $6 million for that so far, with the ongoing work that we're currently doing with the second wing. And the funding, the fund source itself came through our state general fund.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen and Shelby. We really appreciate you staying on to answer some questions, and thank you so much for your very insightful presentation. I know our team was really excited about it, and it lived up to expectations. So we were so excited to have you join us today. As a reminder, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar within a few days. That'll have Shelby and Kristen's contact information in it, so you're welcome to reach out to them with any questions, or to our team, and we're happy to connect you. One other thing I need to mention, it is National Crime Victims' Rights Week this week. So we are really excited about the theme from OVC this year, which is how would you help options, services, and hope for crime survivors? And NCVC's team actually helped create the resource guide this year. So there's all kinds of social media posts, printable awareness posters, and other things that you and your organization can use to raise awareness of crime victims' rights this week and for the rest of the year. So you can find that at ovc.ojp.gov. And then there's also a list of events in your area on that website as well. So I hope that you are all celebrating and honoring Crime Victims' Rights Week in your own way within your organizations. It was so good to virtually see everyone today, and we hope to see you next month at the next webinar. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.